I'm here joined by Natalie Smolenski. She is the Senior Advisor at the Bitcoin Policy Institute and Executive Director of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. She also heads up business development at Highland Innovation. She recently released a white paper titled Why the U.S. Should Reject Central Bank Digital Currencies, alongside a follow-up article on Bitcoin Magazine called The Dangerous Implications of Central Bank Digital Currencies. Wow. Natalie, tell us, how did you get on this mission to bring awareness of CBDCs, as they're sometimes called?
Yeah, I actually got into Bitcoin in a way that's a little unusual through digital identity. I worked at a software company that partnered with MIT to build the very first digital identity wallet using Bitcoin as a secure anchor of trust. And so the promise of Bitcoin for me from the beginning was something called self-sovereign identity, SSI for short sometimes. And all that means is that you and I have control over our identity, how it's expressed digitally, how it is used, who it's shared with, what it's used for. That is becoming a more and more difficult proposition in a world where digital technologies are everywhere. And so that also means we're constantly creating these data trails about ourselves. And those data trails are valuable. They're valuable both to private companies and to governments. And so what we're seeing is a kind of nexus of interests, which some scholars have called surveillance capitalism, that is basically using this digital data about people to exercise control of populations at scale. And so CBDCs, when I heard about them for the first time, I was mostly annoyed, but not too surprised. I expected something like this would come, and I felt like someone just needed to write the definitive takedown.
So you saw the writing on the wall with
Yeah.
everything that we deal with that's digital. And when these kind of started coming to light, you rose up and were like, I'm going to highlight this. And you're warning people about the dangers of them.
Right. That's exactly right.
So before we get into that,
Yeah.
would you mind explaining, how do you define a CBDC?
Yeah, a CBDC is a central bank digital currency. And I would say that the idea for CBDCs actually arose thanks to Bitcoin, because central banks started feeling like potentially Bitcoin could be competition for fiat currencies. And the Bitcoin innovation, peer-to-peer, censorship-resistant distributed ledger, seemed like a technological innovation that central banks felt like they had to compete with. They're not wrong about that. The problem there is that they basically tried to create their own private blockchains that have attendant cryptocurrencies on them that circulate on these blockchains that are central bank controlled. However, in recent years, there's also been a lot of pushback against the use of blockchain technology for CBDCs at all. And so the newer implementations and technical architectures for CBDCs actually aren't even really cryptocurrencies. They're basically just centralized digital ledgers, no different from the centralized digital ledgers that already exist for, say, commercial bank money or Federal Reserve balances. And so there's been a lot of, from my point of view, innovation theater around CBDCs, a lot of pilots, proofs of concept, companies being contracted to architect these things. But in the end, it just comes down to a centralized ledger of fiat money.
That doesn't necessarily need a consensus mechanism.
Right.
I see.
Yeah.
When I first heard about CBDCs, I just assumed that they were similar to a fiat-backed stablecoin.
Mm-hmm.
What is the subtle difference between those two?
Right. So a fiat-backed stablecoin is actually issued by a commercial bank. So it's issued by a private bank. It's no different from, your current bank issuing money to make loans. So we've always had private money. Economists call this M1 or M2 money supply because it's not a direct liability of the central bank. The only difference between really that and a CBDC is that a CBDC is a direct liability of the central bank. So it's the equivalent of physical cash. Like that's M0 money supply. That's what the Federal Reserve, in effect, or the Treasury prints. And so when money is minted, it is M0 money supply. So from the point of view of the end user, there isn't much difference really between the already like fully digital dollar economy that exists and a CBDC. The main difference is on the back end, on the administrator side, because it is a centralized ledger that is now fully managed by and visible to the central bank.
Perfect. That makes sense. And to play devil's advocate, a lot of people thought CBDCs were going to be a great idea because it would keep people from evading their taxes. It would help, with illicit money laundering, that sort of thing. When did you kind of start to see the dangers?
Yeah. So the way that surveillance is sold to both government actors and ordinary people is crime prevention. We have to have cameras everywhere, watching you, because otherwise how are we going to prevent crime? Or how are we going to catch the perpetrators of crime? It's no different in the financial world. How are we going to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing if every single financial transaction is not monitored and attached to a known identity? So that's what's called AML KYC. This is a banking regulation that really picked up speed in the wake of 9/11. So after 9/11, there was a global push to basically make terrorist financing as difficult as possible by increasing the amount of data that was collected on the holders of every bank account, on every transaction, over a certain amount. And then that amount has been coming down, in real terms ever since. I mean, really ever since the 1970s. The problem with this is that we've been kind of like, the crab or the lobster in a pot of water. Like you just keep turning up the temperature and it doesn't realize that it's being boiled alive. And so we're pretty much at the point where there is no privacy anymore. Like everything you do, certainly online, but increasingly offline too, is documented, recorded, stored, and shared with multiple third parties that you never know about, and who don't have to reveal themselves to you. And so, no one's going to come out and say like, yes, we think it should be easier to finance terrorism. That's like saying, we hate kittens and puppies. So no politician wants to say that. The reality is, though, that this surveillance regime mostly impacts ordinary people who are just going about their daily lives. They're not doing anything wrong. They're not suspected of a crime. They haven't been convicted of a crime. And so there's real Fourth Amendment violations, I would say, underway all the time that are now just accepted. Whereas in the past, the principle of liberty was that the government doesn't have the right to know how much money you have, what you spend your money on, who you associate with, who you meet with, who you talk with. Like that was considered private information, and the government needed to have a warrant, i.e. probable cause of a crime being underway, in order to request that information from you. That is quite simply no longer the case.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Pivoting a little bit, but not exactly.
Yeah.
In your white paper, you make the analogy of a CBDC to food stamps.
Yeah.
Where we could get prohibited from spending them at certain places, or potentially get capped on, the amount of money we're able to spend.
Yeah.
Would you mind elaborating on that?
Right. So CBDCs are programmable money, meaning that the central bank can directly control when and how the CBDC is spent. They, of course, say that they will never do this, but that is a lot of trust to put in an organization that, from my point of view, has done nothing to warrant it. So once money is made programmable, you can do things like implement negative interest rates, which is going to be the first thing that central banks around the world do, which basically means that you're getting punished for saving. Any money you hold in your bank account is going to be, there will be deductions at regular intervals, 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever. This is going to be implemented because governments around the world are facing profound sovereign debt crises. Like, their debt to GDP ratios have skyrocketed in recent decades. They're in effect broke. They've been relying on free money, basically zero interest rates, to debt finance the operation of the state. Now that interest rates are rising, we're basically seeing the global carnage worldwide. Like, governments cannot pay for their basic operations. And the U.S. government may be in a stronger position, but is still vulnerable to this. And so one of the solutions that central banks will implement is harvesting private wealth. And this will happen through negative interest rates, or in some cases through direct confiscation of cash. Programmable money also enables things like, prohibited like blacklists. If this vendor or service provider is, for whatever reason, on a blacklist, you can't do business with them using a CBDC. Those transactions can simply be prohibited in advance. Or a little softer approach could be to simply flag anybody who does business with, these prohibited entities for, additional scrutiny and surveillance. So these are just a few examples of what programmable cash enables. And on a long enough timeline, all of these things will be done.
Wow. And we know that President Biden has issued several reports that are analyzing the infrastructure of the U.S. to see if the U.S. could support a CBDC. What do you think? Is this to make us more competitive from a global perspective? What do you think is the underlying motivation?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the kind of innovation washing that's been done around CBDCs. This is really important. Central banks are feeling embattled technologically. And so there's a desire to present themselves as innovative and keeping pace with the evolution of digital financial services. So what we've seen in the U.S. is there's been a lot of rhetoric from some politicians about keeping up with China. We can't fall behind China in innovation. Few people would disagree with that statement. The problem is, innovation for whom? Is it innovation to create the best and most efficient prison that everybody lives in? That is, in effect, what a surveillance regime does. And so, from my point of view, innovation should be, in the United States, should be a bottom-up process rather than a top-down process. So rather than being directed by the government or directed by the state, innovation should emerge organically from the free association of citizens and residents who are living their lives on the ground and generating productive value that drives our GDP. So I think the push to label CBDCs as innovative is at best a misunderstanding, and at worst an attempt at implementing a China-style surveillance regime in the United States with the, if not consent, lack of opposition from civil society.
Wow. The Texas Bitcoin Foundation and the Texas Blockchain Council, we share a mission in that we are trying to educate policymakers and the public about these sort of topics. What else can we do to advocate against CBDCs?
Yeah. So a couple things. One is, of course, write to your senators, write to your congressional representatives. A CBDC would happen at the federal level. So targeting the Texas congressional delegation is the best thing you can do in the near term as a citizen. The good news is Senator Ted Cruz actually has introduced legislation in the U.S. Senate to prohibit the Fed from issuing a CBDC, from managing, direct retail accounts. The challenge with that legislation, and by the way, Representative Tom Emmer from Minnesota introduced the same legislation in the House. So there is opposition to this. The challenge with it is that these bills target the Federal Reserve. There is also federal legislation called the eCash Act that was recently introduced that would order the U.S. Treasury to issue a CBDC. And so there's a contestation about which, department should own this project if it were to go through at all. And it likely will be snuck in. This is just my point of view, but I suspect that it will be snuck in as part of some omnibus bill that is so long that nobody reads the whole thing, part of, budget legislation. And so this is the challenge. You could make the case, I think many have, that the U.S. Congress is no longer a meaningful deliberative body. In other words, we don't actually debate legislation in Congress anymore. We sort of rubber stamp legislation that has been years in the making, often, away from the public eye, and through a political process that bears little resemblance to what we understand as, how a bill becomes a law. And so I think probably the most important political project today in the United States is reform of the legislative process at the federal level. And I think a discussion needs to be had about the scope and mandate of the federal government. In general, I think having the federal government do less could be the thing that ends up protecting a sphere of civil society, not because the federal government is good or bad, but because there are relatively few things that you can do effectively at a scale of 400 million people. That is a lot of people. And so I think before any CBDC is implemented at that scale, we need to have a conversation as a country about federalism and the importance of civil society.
I'm with you. And I'm thinking about, there's several countries that are wanting to roll this out. India, Sweden.
Yeah.
And then there's countries that already have it going. You discussed China, Bahamas, Jamaica. Do we have any cautionary tales coming out of these countries? Things that are going well, maybe things that are not going well?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Most countries are going this way. So over 100 countries are currently exploring or in the advanced stages of implementing a CBDC. And so this will be the rule, not the exception. This is why I think it's so important for the United States to take a stand and say this is something we will not do, because the lazy approach is to just kind of let this ubiquitous surveillance become ever more ubiquitous with no pushback. So the cautionary tales are several. One is that one of the things that China ran into during its pilots of CBDCs is that people already had such an efficient digital cash system through like WePay and Alipay that they didn't understand the value proposition of a CBDC. Like, why should I use this CBDC app when I can already pretty much do everything digitally? And all of that is fully surveilled already. So there was a question about, the value proposition there. But, if it's mandated to use CBDCs, then people will use them. And so that's just, application of the violence of the state. In the Eastern Caribbean, we saw another cautionary tale, which is that the maintenance of the technical infrastructure is a big challenge. Governments are not designed to deliver and maintain software for the most part. That's not their mandate. And so there are some very technically sophisticated people working in government, but they're not software companies with the singular mission of delivering and maintaining complex software. And so, most of these CBDC applications will be outsourced to the private sector. There will be contracts awarded. And in the areas where the government's responsible for actually maintaining the software, it could be very spotty. And so, like what we saw in the Eastern Caribbean, for example, is that they used a Hyperledger Fabric based private blockchain implementation for their Dcash CBDC. And someone just forgot to update an SSL certificate. And so the CBDC was offline for 2 months while they figured it out. And so it's these really simple, unforced errors that will inevitably happen where the government leads technology implementation on these issues.
Okay, so we're anti-CBDC. We know fiat is like a melting iceberg, maybe ice cube at this point. What's our alternative?
So first and foremost, Bitcoin. I mean, candidly, Bitcoin was made for just this use case. Now, what will happen, what already is happening, is governments will do their best to fully surveil every on-ramp and off-ramp to Bitcoin. And so they'll basically, try to make Bitcoin unusable without the same level of surveillance that they're trying to require from CBDCs. And so, there is a technology imperative to build privacy-preserving solutions for Bitcoin that avoid these on-ramps and off-ramps. That is well underway. There are a lot of companies and individuals and open source projects working on this problem. But second of all, I think it's really important that Americans raise their voice as civil society and say, there is a burden of proof that the government has to have in order to know anything about me. And that is a conversation that has been stigmatized. I mean, really since 9/11, it's been very hard to stand up for privacy in America. The Patriot Act is quite possibly the most far-reaching piece of surveillance legislation ever passed in this country. And it was politically very unpopular to stand against it. I think that's changed now, though. I think we've now seen the fallout of, multiple wars. We've seen how 9/11 was kind of cynically weaponized to promote the personal power of a generation of politicians who many of them have been driven out of office in very public and nasty ways. And so I think we're at a moment right now in American society where the call for privacy will be heard. The question is, are we still the people who can stand up for that?
Wow. You and Dan Held wrote an article, kind of a follow-up to your white paper. How has that been received by the public?
Yeah, so Bitcoin Magazine actually excerpted a part of our CBDC white paper and published it as a standalone piece. And I think that got a lot of readership. I would imagine that more people read that excerpt than the actual full white paper, which is a very long research report. I think in the Bitcoin community, this issue is very well understood. I think it's beyond the Bitcoin community where there are challenges. And building those bridges, I think, is a critical mission of organizations like the Texas Blockchain Council and the Texas Bitcoin Foundation.
Natalie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of this insight. Can you tell our viewers where can they find you on social media? Where can they find your white paper? All that good stuff.
Absolutely. So you can find me at nataliesmolenski.com. I'm also on Twitter at @nsmolenski. The Texas Bitcoin Foundation has its own website. You can just literally Google us. It will pop up. We have, Twitter. We have an Instagram. The white paper and my other articles are linked on those websites. So please do visit if you would like to have a more in-depth conversation about any of these issues and how to help build this bridge from the Bitcoin community to broader American civil society. I'd love to hear from you.
Nellie, you're going to be speaking at the Texas Blockchain Summit as well, November 17th and 18th. We are greatly looking forward to that.
Yes.
What's going to be the topic of your keynote?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the important work that's been happening in Texas on the legislative front and the policy front. So the Texas Blockchain Council in 2021 spearheaded the passage of a bill to create a state work group for blockchain matters. That is a body of subject matter experts that was appointed by the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the House. And our report is coming out in early November. So I'm going to be talking about the policy recommendations in that report, about some of the educational initiatives that the Texas Bitcoin Foundation is spearheading, and then how that all applies to the macroeconomic climate that we're living in today in the United States.
Natalie, thank you so much for spending this time with us to educate us and all the work that you're doing. We certainly appreciate it.
Yes, it's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Hey, it's Amy. Click over here to subscribe. Click over here for more content, and we'll see you next time.